We heard earlier from Reese giving some theoretical background to how and why we should be monitoring GPS tagged birds to assess the safety of a vulture safe zone. Here I'm going to discuss how this has been applied to the assessment of the vulture safe zone in Nepal by looking at survival of movements of wild and released GPS tagged white rump vultures. We've been tagging white rumps since 2017, and up to March 2022, 50 wild birds had been caught and tagged, while 49 birds had been released from the conservation breeding population. As Ankit explained earlier, further tagging was done last October, and the last cohort of captive birds will be released this March, and at the same time more wild birds will be tagged. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'll just look at survival and movement up until September 2022. Now, as Reese pointed out, to assess the safety of a vulture safe zone, it's better to tag and monitor adults. And so 2/3 of the wild birds we've tagged have also been adults. Now, more released adults have also been tagged, but this has been mainly down to the relatively limited productivity of the captive population. So these adults were originally taken into captivity as chicks and were released having spent 10+ years in captivity. The birds released as sub-adults were actually bred in captivity and were released when 18 to 30 months after they fledged. So very quickly, just to recap why we should tag vultures at all. Well, firstly, it provides an indirect method of assessing prevalence of NSAs, which is clearly important in Asia. Secondly, given the rarity of vultures, very few fresh dead birds are found. Monitoring tagged birds increases the chances of actually finding dead birds. Thirdly, it provides an unbiased measure of the prevalence of different causes of death, and Reese explained why that was important. And finally, it provides the most accurate method of estimating annual survival rates. So the two reasons why it's important to track wild adult birds are their ranging behavior and their survival rates. So let's first look at the movements. So wild birds, which are here shown in blue, tend to display similar behavior irrespective of their age. All birds have tended to remain within around 200 kilometers of the trapping site, which is shown on these maps by the white star. And although they spend most of their time in Western Nepal, we've also heard that they regularly make excursions into northern India, especially into Uttar Pradesh, across the border. However, as the map on the right shows, 2 of the adult birds did make exceptional journeys, one traveling close to the Pakistan border in Himachal Pradesh and Kashmir, the other going as far south as Maharashtra before turning back and returning to Nepal. Now, in contrast, the released birds shown in red have tended to remain more local, especially those released as sub-adults, with most of their movements occurring not far from the release site. In fact, for the first 2.5 years, the maximum distance traveled by a released bird was only 7 kilometers. Although from spring 2020 onwards, several birds did take longer flights, including 2 that ended up high in the Himalayas, which is unusual for a plains-loving bird such as the white rump vulture. And this is further illustrated by a comparison of the home range sizes of the different groups of birds. The only significant differences here are between the wild and the released birds, and it's quite marked. Wild birds ranging over 10,000 square kilometers, while those released from captivity on average tending to be confined to an area 1/10 this size, under 1,000 square kilometers. However, whether birds were of wild or captive origin, they have similar home range sizes, irrespective of their age at release or capture. So the second reason for tagging wild birds is not only will they range over a larger area, but they're more likely to survive. Now, one of the key aspirations of any reintroduction program is that released birds will have similar survival rates to wild birds. but this clearly hasn't been the case here. Both adult and subadult released birds suffered higher mortality than in the corresponding wild groups, significantly so when comparing the adults of the two groups. Now, contrary to what is found in many reintroduction programs, in released birds, survival here was lower for adults than for subadults. But it's worth remembering that birds released as adults were originally brought to the breeding center as chicks and have been in captivity for over a decade. And this appears to have had an impact on their survival capabilities once they've been released. Further to what Reese said earlier, it's worth also noting the size of the confidence intervals. Wild adults have been monitored for the equivalent of 77 vulture years, hence the narrower confidence intervals, and the lower one being as high as 0.91, 91%. While in the released adults, they've only been monitored for 31 vulture years, hence the larger confidence intervals, and a chance that their true survival could be as low as 50%. But let's return to the wild adults. How does their survival compare with that of gyps vultures from stable populations elsewhere in the world? This figure shows published annual survival rates of Eurasian griffons in Spain and France, and African whiteback vultures in South Africa. As you can see, annual survival rates of vultures tend to be very high, about 95% or more in adults, while that of subadults is typically lower, but still around 85%. The survival rates of both adult and subadult white rump vultures are very similar to those of the other gyps vultures. These results strongly suggest that the environment over which Nepal's vultures range is free from diclofenac. But birds do die. So what has been killing our tagged vultures? We've taken a conservative approach to assigning mortality. So for instance, if a tag fails to transmit and the bird is not subsequently seen and a carcass isn't found, then the bird is still considered to have died on the date of the last transmission. This happened for the wild bird that I mentioned before that almost made it to Pakistan. Similarly, if a bird was taken into care, as happened to several released birds, it was considered to have died on that day, even if it subsequently recovered. And being picked up weak through starvation and dehydration was the greatest cause of so-called mortality, for released birds at least. And this was especially so after birds took longer than usual flights, including the two birds that ended up in the Himalayas. However, 6 of the birds did recover, having been taken into care, and were released back into the wild, with at least one of those birds, a female, successfully nesting. Other sources of mortality, which you've also heard about before, at least of released birds, have included electrocution on power lines, as well as being killed by children with a catapult and collision with the walls of the aviary just after release. Now, a number of birds were found dead at the release site infested with roundworms, although this isn't likely to have been the actual cause of death. However, as a result of these deaths, hygiene has been improved at the vulture restaurant, and there have been no more fatalities such as this since the summer of 2020. But most significant of all is what is missing from this table. There have been no confirmed cases of diclofenac or any NSA poisoning. So the high survival rates, lack of evidence for NSA-caused poisoning, suggested the environment is safe, free from diclofenac, and the area over which the vultures range should be considered a genuinely safe vulture-safe zone. But there's other evidence too. Firstly, we've previously seen that diclofenac has stopped being offered for veterinary use, especially in the Western Terai, where the tagged vultures tended to range. Not only that, there's been good evidence for a partial recovery in populations of both white-rumped and slender-billed vultures. And as we saw earlier, the surveys in 2022 have shown that this upward trend is continuing. As a consequence of all this evidence, In December 2021, Nepal's vulture safe zone was declared genuinely safe. The extent of the area was based on the movements of the wild birds, hence the size was smaller than the theoretically envisaged, just 7,500 rather than 30,000 square kilometers, and the area was somewhat amoeboid in shape, based as it was on where the birds spent most of their time. Thank you for listening.